I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing as a PhD student at the Midlands Patient Safety Research Collaboration, using data from Pioneer, which is a source of routinely collected healthcare data from 3 hospital sites across Birmingham. And we've been looking at the impact of regulatory intervention by the MHRA on fluoroquinolone prescribing rates in real-world data. So just as a brief bit of background, so what are fluoroquinolones? Well, they are a class of antibiotics, including things like levofloxacin, ciprofloxacin, that are used to treat a wide range of infections. More commonly, they're used to treat severe infections, and they're also used more commonly for patients that are allergic to penicillin antibiotics. And why has regulatory intervention been introduced? Well, that's because they've been associated with some serious, disabling, long-term, potentially irreversible side effects affecting multiple bodily systems, including the musculoskeletal system and the nervous system. And this figure below just highlights some of the interventions that have been introduced by the MHRA in the last 7 or 8 years. And I'll just highlight a couple of those. So March 2019 is probably the first significant intervention that was put into place, and that came off the back of some work by the European Medicines Agency, who did a pharmacovigilance study and identified this association with disabling side effects. And on the back of this, they recommended that EU member states then introduce restrictions on the use of fluoroquinolones. So they suggested that they shouldn't be prescribed for some non-severe infections and for some certain patient groups. A reminder about this intervention was then introduced by the MHRA in August 2023. And then in January 2024, they quite substantially changed the wording of their recommendation. So now, rather than just saying non-severe and in certain patient groups, they said that fluoroquinolones must not be prescribed unless other commonly recommended antibiotics are inappropriate. And that's the intervention that we're particularly interested in as part of this study. So as I said, we used data from Pioneer, 3 hospital sites in Birmingham. We included patients that had a primary diagnosis of pneumonia at discharge, who had thoracic imaging requested within 48 hours of admission and antibiotics prescribed within 72 hours of admission. We excluded people that had a diagnostic code for hospital-acquired pneumonia or a recent admission to hospital, and we excluded patients with a penicillin allergy because they'd be prescribed systematically different antibiotics. And this left us with 13,631 unique admissions between January 2018 and October 2024. Okay, so this slide just highlights what the guideline recommended antibiotics are for patients with community-acquired pneumonia. And the only thing I want to say here is that fluoroquinolones aren't recommended for any severity of pneumonia for patients without a penicillin allergy. Despite this, they are prescribed. So if we look at the graph in the bottom left corner here, you can see how fluoroquinolone use has changed over time in Birmingham. So on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have the number of days a fluoroquinolone was prescribed per 100 days that any antibiotic was prescribed. And at the start of this period, we can see that around 30% of antibiotic days a fluoroquinolone was prescribed. There's quite a sharp drop throughout 2020, and then that's been fairly stable from 2022 to 2024 at around 10%. So what we did is we did a segmented regression analysis using the regulatory intervention in January 2024. We only used data from 2022 onwards, as this avoided some of the broader changes in antibiotic prescribing that happened around the main period of the COVID pandemic. And the results of the graph are slightly misleading because they kind of suggest that fluoroquinolone use may have increased after the intervention, but actually when you adjust for pneumonia severity, it's essentially a flat line with an incidence rate ratio of 1 and very narrow confidence intervals from 1 to 1. So essentially there was no impact of the most recent intervention by the MHRA on fluoroquinolone use in Birmingham. So in summary, fluoroquinolone use has decreased quite substantially since 2018. However, the most recent intervention by the MHRA hasn't made any further impact on prescribing in Birmingham. And I think that it's important that we remember that fluoroquinolones aren't guideline recommended for any of these patients. So 10% is still a fairly high proportion. So it raises some interesting questions about mechanisms through which regulatory intervention can actually catalyze behavior change. But I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.